Welcome to Store Brand Comics. I'm Tio and I talk about comic books. It's really kind of all in the name there, I guess. Today we're continuing our series on Valiant Comics as a publisher. And we're making this video is about the second series that they started publishing after their relaunch in 2012, Harbinger. Which, in my opinion, is one of the best series that they had going for them, like right at the beginning of their relaunch. The first volume is called Omega Rising, and I'm going to get into the credits before I talk about anything else. This book collects the first 5 issues of the Harbinger series. Issue 1, well, the whole thing is written by Joshua Dysart. And issue 1 has art by Kari Evans, colors by Ian Hannon, letters by Rob Steen, with cover art by Arturo Lozzi. Issue 2 has art by Kari Evans and Luis LaRosa, with colors by Ian Hannon and Moose Bauman, lettered by Rob Steen, with cover art by Arturo Lozzi. And then issue 3 has art by Kari Evans and Luis LaRosa, colors by Ian Hannon and Moose Bauman, letters by Rob Steen, and cover art by Arturo Lozzi with Matt Milla. Not quite sure how it's pronounced. Issue number 4 has art by Kari Evans with Matthew Clark and Luis LaRosa, colors by Ian Hannon, letters by Rob Steen, and cover art by Patrick Zurcher. And issue number 5 is penciled by Kari Evans with Matthew Clark and Jim Muniz, inks by Kari Evans with Matt Ryan and Sean Parsons, and colored by Ian Hannon with Jeremy Cox and Chris Satomayor, lettered by Rob Steen, with cover art by Miko Swayan with Moose Bauman. I hope that's how it's pronounced. And gallery art in the back by David Aha, Doug Braithwaite, Kari Evans, Jelena Kevic-Jurjevic, there's that name again, Luis LaRosa, Miko Swayan, and Patrick Zurcher. The assistant editor for 3 issues was Josh Johns. The associate editor is Jody LaHoop, and the editor is Warren Simons. And the collection cover art is by Arturo Lozzi, because this is also the cover to the first issue. I told you Valiant Comics credit sections were going to be a bit longer in the previous video, so I actually think that I might just actually keep the credit sections to just the beginning of the video, so that you know up top who made the book, instead of reading it at the beginning and the end like I do with my other videos, because it's very long, there are a lot of names, but I like to be thorough. So yeah, Harbinger. This is kind of, in a way, Valiant's X-Men. Because there are a lot of parallels to the X-Men, honestly, in this. It's about like a group of super people who are born with the capacity for superpowers. It's just a lot of them need to be activated. The main character is particularly powerful compared to others. These superhumans are referred to as Psyots, or Psyots, or however you want to pronounce it. I usually say Psyot. But what that means is a Psyot is someone who is born with the potential for psychic powers. The interesting thing about Valiant's natural-born superhuman characters is that none of them are, like, physically capable because of their powers. All of the natural superpowers in Valiant Comics are, like, psychic in nature. So the main character, this guy on the cover here, is, or I guess this is actually, I prefer this image of him personally. But yeah, that is Peter Stanchek, and he was born with a collection of psychic abilities, actually, and he was born active, which means he has always had his powers. As far as, and they even go as far as to state in this book that, as far as anyone's aware, he is one of 3 Sciats in the entire world that were born active. So yeah, he's a pretty rare occurrence, and his powers include like the standard telepathy, telekinesis, flight, some like limited force field capabilities, that sort of thing. But in general, his powers tend to be pretty volatile because he never like learned how to control them. So when he does like use his powers willingly, which is rare, it tends to be in the form of like lashing out almost violently with them. And because he kind of had a difficult upbringing as a result of his powers, he spent most of his life in a psychiatric facility where they experimented on him, basically, as far as I'm aware. There's a flashback scene in this book of him going through like electroshock therapy as a kid, so I don't know if that was experimentation or like a legit attempt at electroshock therapy, but it's still a pretty gruesome scene. This is I'm going to say a dark series, especially to start with, just like emotionally, because as I said before, the main character, he basically grew up in a psychiatric facility, and then eventually escaped with one of his fellow patients, and he's been using his powers to keep himself and his friend named Joe hidden from the people who are chasing after them for a long time, all the while also using his powers to basically rob pharmacies for their drugs and the money in the register so that they can, survive. But yeah, he steals drugs from pharmacies because it helps him numb his powers. And he also gets antipsychotics for his friend who escaped with him because his friend is legitimately troubled and needs his medications to help him level out. So yeah, it's an interesting little setup there. And then on the flip side of that, you get another character named, and he's one of my favorite characters in all of the Valiant universe, Toyo Harada. He's a Japanese businessman who was a child during World War II, and he survived the bombing of Hiroshima, and was basically left to survive in the wasteland that was left over. And that's when his powers activated. The bomb activated Harada. So Harada is not one of the 3 who was born active. But Harada essentially has the same collection of psychic abilities that Peter has. So there are kind of some parallels between the 2 of them. And Harada founded a global conglomerate called Harada Global Conglomerate, I believe is what it's called, HGC for short. And it's one of those massive multinational corporations where like they've got their hands in everything. Technology, science, medicine, you name it, they are not only funding it but also being funded by it. However, Harada is very strict with his ethics. No war profiteering is one thing. He doesn't like war, having been one of the civilian victims of it as a child. So yeah, his whole stance is like he's striving for world peace, and he's founded this school for Sciats called the Harbinger Foundation, hence the title of the book, where he takes in kids with psychic powers and helps train them to use their abilities so that they can someday use it for the betterment of the world. I would say, as far as his attitude goes, Harada is kind of what you would get if you mixed Charles Xavier and Magneto into the same character, um, which kind of furthers the X-Men parallel. Because, like Charles Xavier, he desires world peace. He desires a place for his superpowered kind in the world, and he trains kids to use their powers for the betterment of mankind overall. But then you get that Magneto aspect where, like, he's a little cold, a little strict. His backstory involves surviving one of the most horrendous things to happen in human history, which just happens to be tied directly to World War II. In Magneto's case, that was surviving the Holocaust. In Harada's case, that's surviving the nuking of Hiroshima. So, yeah, there's a lot of parallels there between those characters. So, I am going to, much like I did with the Exo Man-O-War video, I am kind of going to spoil some plot details for this volume, just to kind of try to, hook people in, because this series has an interesting hook. The plot kind of kicks off with Peter and his friend Joe in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, obviously. And, they're doing their, usual thing of just kind of moving around, covertly robbing pharmacies for their drugs and their money, and then squatting in some place until it's time to move on. And the reason that Peter wanted to go back to Pittsburgh, which is where he was born and grew up for a little bit, is because there was a girl there named Chris that he knew when he was a kid, and he mostly had like good memories of her, so he tried to reconnect with her now that they are teenagers verging on adulthood, but she didn't really want to have anything to do with him. So he kind of psychically coerces her to fall in love with him, which is and the book definitely shines a spotlight on this fact, but that is creepy and wrong and weird. But the book definitely makes sure that, like, that's the stance it's taking on it too. Like, the book knows that, like, that's a wrong thing to do. It's not trying to paint this as like some sort of romantic gesture of him just trying to reach out to someone, because he is just trying to reach out to someone, but he doesn't quite know how, so he goes about it entirely the wrong way. So what ends up happening is Joe has been refusing to take the meds that Peter is getting for him, basically, like, putting it in his mouth, pretending to take it, and then spitting it out later. The sort of thing that patients do in actual psychiatric hospitals. And the reason Peter wants to make sure that Joe stays on his meds is because if Joe starts freaking out, then Peter's going to feel that in his head, and he's going to start freaking out. So it's better that they're both medicated, Peter to numb his power, and Joe to just numb him in general. But yeah, so Joe's been skipping his meds, so he kind of goes off on his own for a little bit. Cops catch him, and he gets interrogated by a man named Tull, Agent Tull, who Joe calls Dull Tull, because this is a guy that he and Peter have encountered before, and Peter usually wipes his memory, apparently, whenever they meet him. But Tull keeps finding them somehow, because the people he works for remind him of what he's doing. So eventually, like, Tull just lets Joe go, and Joe goes back to the house that he and Peter were squatting in, which leads Tull right to them. He just tailed Joe there. And you get this scene of, like, a helicopter's coming down on them. You got, like, this whole SWAT team of guys rushing in on them, and at this point Peter's got, this Chris girl with him. Um, so not only are Peter and Joe about to get captured, but they have this random innocent girl just in danger. So what happens is Peter is visited by a dog, which is actually a psychic projection from Toyo Harada, encouraging Peter to like try using his powers to get out of the situation, which he does. It causes the helicopter to crash down on top of the house and explode. But he like psychically like lashes out at all of these guys that have come after them and mind wipes Tull so bad that he just leaves him drooling on the sidewalk. Using his powers and telling him like, you know, forget everything that makes you who you are, just forget. And Tull's just left there with nothing left inside. He's an empty shell, basically. So yeah. And Harada kind of fills Peter in on who these people are. Like, Tull works for an organization, and this part's going to be very important. There's an organization called Project Rising Spirit who hunts Syots, particularly Syot kids, for, at this point, unknown reasons. I will get into that later. In later videos, I mean. Probably not later this video. I just need to make sure that I really impress upon you Project Rising Spirit is going to be an important name to remember moving forward with the Harbinger series as well as the Valiant universe in general. After Peter escapes these Project Rising Spirit soldiers, I guess for lack of a better word, he and Joe and Chris end up going with to people from the Harbinger Foundation that Harada sent to pick them up. Then Harada, you know, mind wipes everyone, like all the neighbors that were on that particular street. Like, you didn't hear an explosion, you didn't see a helicopter crash, everybody go back to sleep. It's a very convenient, like, Men in Black situation going on, where it's like you go about your day, sort of thing. So yeah, then once Peter, Chris, and Joe are taken to a certain point, Chris and Joe are separated from Peter, and Peter, after, you know, realizing what he had done to Chris, releases her from the psychic love spell that he put on her, and she instantly goes from I love you more than anything and you are my world to I'm going to cut your balls off. Like, she actually says that in the book. She is so horrendously infuriated, and, you know, justifiably so. He violated her pretty harshly. So yeah, she's very angry about that. And Joe, upon realizing that, like, oh my god, he had this girl in some kind of spell, like, he kind of tells Peter to his face, like, dude, you are the most terrifying person I've ever met in my life. And that's like the last thing Peter hears from really his only friend before being taken off to the Harbinger Foundation to train in this secret X-Men base. So yeah, over the course of the first few issues, Peter basically just kind of trains at Harada's school, hones his powers a little bit, but for the most part, like, he's kind of put through a psychological ringer because they have a psychologist on staff with her own psychic abilities, and she she and a little Indian boy named Darpan, who both have psychic powers. Darpan is one of the other two Syots who was born active. And he was born with a particularly harsh power. He was born with the ability to project a full, like, simulation of your harshest memories into your brain, forcing you to relive probably the worst moments of your life, likely more clearly than when you first experienced them. So, and having that power as a baby, um, just in an Indian slum when he was first born, there was no one who was willing to take care of him except an old lady who herself clawed her own eyes out at the sight of the projections that he was unconsciously forcing into her brain just as a newborn baby. So the only person in the world who was really able to withstand him was Toyo Harada, who forced himself through reliving the bombing of Hiroshima just so he could pick this baby up and show him probably the first sign of genuine human affection he'd ever felt in his entire life, just to hold him. So it's a very, very touching and also extremely harsh moment, because this baby, just by the nature of his powers, has probably never really been properly held by anyone, and so Harada was probably the first person to really carry him just by willing himself through that and using his psychic powers to dampen the effects of what Darpan could do. So by the point Peter meets Darpan, he's about a 10-year-old boy. He's not a baby anymore. So the psychologist they have on staff at the Harbinger Foundation has Darpan project some of the harsher memories from Peter's life in his brain to kind of force him to confront his traumas. And that doesn't go over fantastically. Then they train Peter for a while. Peter doesn't really get the chance to directly communicate with Harada very frequently. And then Harada tells Peter about his plan, because one thing that he has known about Peter after studying him for a while is that he has the potential to activate inactive Psyots and give them their powers. So they bring in this girl named Faith, who has the potential to be a Psyot. And Peter is really hesitant to activate her because Harada showed Peter that they do have a way to activate Psyots, but it's an extremely painful process that kills 1 in every 4 Psyot candidates instead of activating them. So Harada was like, your powers, if you can learn to do this, are probably the safest way we're ever going to figure out to activate someone's powers. Peter really didn't want to do it, but this girl, she was already in there. She was dead set on getting superpowers. So Harada told Peter, it's her or the machine that might kill her. It's you or the machine that might kill her. Either way, we're going through with this procedure. So Peter reaches into her brain, tries to activate her. It's a really painful process, and she doesn't get powers out of it. At least, not right away. So Peter is really hesitant to ever do that again. And he just kind of wants to get out of there. He started seeing, hallucinations of his friend Joe telling him, just get out of here, dude. You gotta, and Peter's like, yeah, you know what? I do want to get out of here. So one of the higher ranking members of Harada's organization, a woman known as Livewire, who has the ability to communicate with machines, she kind of secretly agrees to make the Harbinger Foundation's security systems look the other way for just a little while, so that Peter can escape and go look for Joe. So that's what happens. She shuts the machines down for 10 minutes so Peter can get out and look for Joe. And once he's out there, he follows this hallucination of Joe to this rundown crack house building. And while he's there, he ends up finding Joe's dead body. Joe overdosed on, I'm assuming, heroin, because it involved a needle. But Peter notes, like, Joe hated needles. If he was going to OD, it would have been on pills. And then the psychologist lady, Ingrid, she shows up. She's like, this is going to happen eventually, but now, you can come back, you can train so that things like this don't happen again. You can train to be powerful enough to protect people like this. And as they're leaving, Peter's kind of listening to the thoughts of all of the other people in the building, and they're all blank. He's like, these people have been wiped. He's like, Science have been here. And instantly he puts it together, like, the Harbinger Foundation, Harada, killed Joe. So Peter instantly, like, lashes out, forcibly digs his way into Ingrid's mind to get the information that he needs out of her to confirm his suspicions, and then he takes off and basically assaults the Harbinger Foundation, and tries to, I guess, bring it all down. Harada very quickly figures out that Livewire is the one who let Peter go, and Peter already, like, right at the end of just the first book, Peter nearly dies just to lash out at Harada just once. And as he's, like, falling from the top of the Harada Global Conglomerate building skyscraper, thinking that he's gonna hit the ground and die at some point, eventually he's caught by that girl that he couldn't activate before, Faith. She got the ability to fly from what he did inside her brain. So she catches him and saves him, and flies off with him. And that's basically the first volume of Harbinger, like, in a nutshell. Very large nutshell. This is nearly a 30-minute video already. But yeah, that's the basic plot of the first volume of Harbinger. A lot more happens in the first volume of Harbinger than what happened in the first volume of X-O Manowar. Like, the first volume of X-O Manowar took its story, like, very slow, one piece at a time, kind of really only hits those 4 major plot points, like 1 major plot point per issue. But the first volume of Harbinger, not only is 1 issue longer than the first volume of X-O Manowar, so already that's going to be a few more pages of story, but on top of that, like, every issue has more information in it, because there's just more to the Harbinger series in terms of setup. It has more characters, more concepts, more powers, more organizations, more, complex motivations for its characters. There's just so much more in Harbinger. And I think that's one of the reasons why it is so good, because it's complex without being confusing. And one thing that I really like about it is, like I said towards the beginning of the video, Harada is basically what would happen if Charles Xavier and Magneto were the same person. Because, also, like I said before, his goal is world peace. But what a lot of people don't really realize about him is that his goal is world peace at all costs. He is willing to effectively be the world's greatest supervillain if it means that eventually there will be world peace. He is such an interesting character, and I didn't really get to touch on Harada as a character very much in this video, because he's not really touched on a whole lot as an individual character in this first volume. Harada is fleshed out way more over the course of this series overall, as well as through other series, because Harada is essentially the Valiant Universe's Doctor Doom equivalent. So you can trust that he will pop up in more than just Harbinger. He's a very important figure in Valiant Comics' universe. So yeah, he's Toyo Harada is probably one of my favorite characters in all of Valiant comics, as is Faith, that girl who can fly. Um, I will have more to say on her in future videos because for now she really is just kind of like a nerd girl who wanted superpowers and got the power of flight. So now she has like that first step towards like living out her personal dream of being a superhero. But yeah, she's one of my favorite characters. She gets fleshed out more as this series goes on as well. This first volume was very much about establishing the main character, Peter, and his reasons for his conflict with the Harbinger Foundation. So yeah, Harbinger. Harbinger, the X-Men of Valiant Comics. Very interesting, very good read. Yeah, I guess that's all I have to say about it. So if you enjoyed this video, if you found it helpful, if you think that it directed you towards a series that you might be interested in, I've got more like this on the way, so like and subscribe. That's in order. And I will see you next time. Hey, I'm recording this bit later, as you can probably tell, because the lighting is different and my shirt is different, but I forgot to actually give the first volume of Harbinger a rating. So, as far as like accessibility to the Valiant universe at large goes, I give Harbinger a 10 out of 10. At least these first 4 volumes of books that I'm talking about are probably just going to be natural 10 out of 10s for Valiant as a universe. And then there are 3 characters that, no, 4, kind of 4 characters that I want to give like ratings to as far as how easy it is to start reading about them. For Peter, the main character, obviously this is like a 10 out of 10 for him, as well as for Faith, since this is really where she gets her start and she's an important character moving forward. And for Toyo Harada, again, this is probably a 10 out of 10 for him as a character, as far as like an entry point goes. And a 4th character, this might surprise you since she didn't play a huge role in this book, is the character Livewire. And I'm going to be giving her like an entry point rating of, I want to say, probably a 6 out of 10. She's present enough that you can get something out of this book for her as a character, but she's not so important that like you have to start reading Livewire's story here, because Livewire is another character who is going to be kind of important moving forward. So you know, she'll be getting different accessibility ratings as she makes more appearances through the Valiant titles. But yeah, so those are kind of, you know, my thoughts on how accessible this is as a volume. It's, you know, got a pretty high rating, so it should be a pretty easy one to jump in on if it's your first Valiant title. So yeah, as I said before, if you like this video, then give it a like. If you subscribe to this video, then do that too. That is in order. So yeah, just had to get this bit done real quick because I forgot to do it when I was supposed to. Next week, I'm going to be talking about a character whose profile is about to be pretty highly elevated, given the fact that today, I'm recording this the day that his first movie trailer came out. Next week, I'm going to be talking about Bloodshot. So, alright. Cool beans.